Salvete omnes, I'm Amelia, also known as TheMartianGeek. Today I'm going to do something novel for this channel, explain how the password system in Mega Man 7 works. I'd like to say that this is a project I've been wanting to do for a while, but it's really not. I did all my work on it back in January. I started figuring out stuff on the 14th and finished on the 16th, and honestly I have no idea what prompted me to look into it in such detail in the first place. Also, I think Mega Man 7 is a very underappreciated game and is better than Mega Man 2. I owe a lot of thanks to the Mega Man homepage, or MMHP. Their Mega Man 7 password generator helped immensely with this project. You might be thinking, wait, if somebody else already went through the necessary work, what's the point of this? Well, they have the generator and some steps to take if you don't want to use it, but they don't actually explain how it works in detail. Even checking the source code for the generator suggests that its programmer understood the system in a different way than I did. There's also at least one minor point of interest that they didn't seem to account for at all. So, without further ado, here is my explanation of Mega Man 7's password system. The passwords in Mega Man 7 at the simplest level consist of 16 numbers placed in a 4x4 grid. Each of them can change depending on various things you've done in the game, which stages you've beaten, which items you've collected, and so on. There is a base password that corresponds to the default unaltered state of the game, which is 8735251744168362, and all other passwords change relative to that. It's really easy to tell what changes if you use a hex editor or other tool to change the default password to all the same number. The default password is its Super Nintendo address 80A245 if you care to know. The way that they change is based on bit flipping, which of course is based on binary numbers. If you'd prefer not to listen to the technical details out of boredom, not understanding well enough, or whatever, you can skip ahead in the video to the part where I simply explain what all the possible numbers do. If you think that binary and bitwise commands are no big deal, let's continue. Each of the 16 squares can contain a number from 1 to 8, which corresponds to all possible values of a set of 3 bits in binary. The 8 is internally stored as a 0. A proper binary representation of the number 8 would require a 4th bit, but the lowest 3 bits would still be 0 anyway, so think of the 8 as a 0. With 16 numbers and 3 bits per number, there are 48 bits that make up each password. All 48 of them are used, some more than others. The game stores information 1 bit, or flag, at a time, but the bits aren't in order. So for instance, there aren't 8 bits in a row that correspond to clearing the Robot Master stages, then 1 for each of the items you can get, and so on. No, these bits are spread all over the grid, presumably to make changes less obvious. Also, items that you can have more than one of, such as bolts and tanks, store their binary representation of that number, again, 1 bit at a time and not together. The game also has a few different checks for invalid passwords, such as having certain combinations of items or stages beaten that shouldn't be possible, in which case you'll just get an error. It also has 2 bits to check for the total number of flags that are turned on, mod 4, or if you prefer, bitwise and 3, which means that if you just input a random set of numbers, you have a 75% chance of getting an error based solely on the item count not matching. Naturally, the item count bits themselves don't count toward the total number of bits that have been flipped. These are the things that the password stores. Which stages you've beaten, which counts all of the Robot Masters plus the Robot Museum mid-stage, but not the Wily stages, for a total of 9 bits. How many E-tanks you have, which is 3 bits. How many W-tanks you have, which is 3 bits. Whether or not you have an S-tank, which is just a single bit. Whether or not you've freed beat, and how many beat whistles you have, which is a total of 4 bits. How many bolts you have, which is 10 bits. Which of the rush circuit plates you found, and whether or not you have the super adapter, which is a total of 5 bits. Whether or not you found Otto's Hyperbolt or given it to him, which each have a bit for a total of 2 bits. Whether or not you have the Rush Jet, Rush Search, Energy Balancer, Exit Module, Rocket Punch, or Proto Shield, which each have 1 bit for a total of 6 bits. Whether or not the second group of Robot Master stages has been added to the stage select, which is 1 bit. Whether or not the Wily stages have opened up, which is 1 bit. Whether or not you should start at the intro stage, which is 1 bit. And finally, the lowest 2 bits of the item count. Remember, all of these passwords are relative to the base password, and each number is 3 bits. So for instance, if you're starting with the 1 and you flip the high bit, it becomes a 5, but if you're starting with the 6 and you flip the high bit, it becomes a 2. The low bit is set if the number is odd, so 1, 3, 5, or 7. The middle bit is set if the number is 2, 3, 6, or 7. And the high bit is set if the number is 4 or greater, so 4, 5, 6, or 7. Remember that 8 counts as 0. The first square controls the S plate, the rush jet, and bit 7 of the bolt count. The high bit is for the S, the middle bit is for the rush jet, and the low bit is for the bolt. If you're not familiar with my binary terminology, bits are numbered from lowest to highest based on the power of 2 that they correspond to, starting with 0. So the 1's place is bit 0, the 2's place is bit 1, the 4's place is bit 2, the 8's place is bit 3, and so on. If your bolt count is 128 to 255, 384 to 511, 640 to 767, or 896 to 999, then this bit will be set. The second square determines whether or not Cloudman's stage is cleared, whether or not you have the energy balancer, and whether or not the second group of Robot Master stages has been added. The high bit is for Cloudman, the middle bit is for the energy balancer, and the low bit is for the second group of stages. An interesting thing about this last bit is that you can either have it set or not in combination with having the first 4 Robot Masters in the museum beaten, and it will still work. Of course, as long as the bits for the total flag count are correct. The only difference is whether or not the animation of the other 4 stages being added will play. If you don't set the flag in the password, it will get set anyway once the stage icons lock into place. The third square has bit 1 of the bolt count, bit 8 of the bolt count, and bit 1 of the beat whistle count. The lowest bit will be flipped if you have 2 or 3 beat whistles, while the middle bit will be flipped if the number of bolts you have is 256 to 511 or 768 to 999. The highest bit will be flipped if the number of bolts you have is even but not divisible by 4, or if it's 1 less than a multiple of 4. The fourth square has bit 2 of the W tank count, bit 2 of the beat whistle count, and bit 1 of the W tank count. Since the number of E-tanks, W-tanks, and beat whistles can normally only be 0 to 4, both the high and middle bits here will only be flipped if you have the full 4 W-tanks or beat whistles respectively, and the lowest bit will only be flipped if you have 2 or 3 W-tanks. Interestingly, it actually is possible to give yourself more than 4 E-tanks or W-tanks via a password. The game won't complain, but only 4 tanks will be displayed. You can also do the same thing with the beat whistles, and unlike with the tanks, these actually will show more than 4 if you have that many, which looks pretty silly because the extra ones overwrite the menu graphics to the right of where the row of icons would normally end. The fifth square determines whether or not the Wily stages have been revealed, bit 0 of the bolt count, and whether or not Springman stage has been cleared. The lowest bit is simple enough, but the other two are kind of interesting. The middle bit will be flipped if your bolt count is an odd number, but since all possible amounts of bolts that you can either obtain or spend are even, the only way that this bit can ever be flipped is if you max out your bolts at 999, and once you do so, it can never be flipped back for the same reason. So if at any point you max out your bolts, thereafter you'll always be left with 1 bolt that's impossible to do anything with. Bad news for the people with OCD. This isn't true for Mega Man and Base, which gives you bolts in increments of 5 and 15, but that game has a save system rather than passwords anyway. As for the highest bit, it will get flipped automatically after the cutscene where Base breaks into Dr. Light's lab, but it is possible to set all the bits for the other 9 stages without having this one set. If you do that, then the Wily stages won't be accessible until you enter a stage and beat it again, after which the cutscene will play and Wily's Fortress will open up. The sixth square has bit 9 of the bolt count, bit 4 of the bolt count, and the bit for Shademan stage being cleared. The highest bit will be flipped if you have 512 or more bolts. I won't enumerate all the possible bolt counts that have the middle bit flipped because that would be a long list of numbers, but if you convert the number of bolts you have to binary and the 5th bit from the right is a 1, then this bit will be set. The low bit, of course, goes without saying. It's worth noting that even though you could theoretically have up to 1023 bolts, trying to put in more than 999 will give you an error, unlike with the tanks and whistles, so you can't get an extra 24 bolts this way. Having too much to drink is fine, overdrawing your bank account not so much. The 7th square controls the H plate, whether or not to start at the intro stage, and bit 0 of the total item count. This is another interesting one. The high bit is simple enough. The low bit will simply be flipped if the total number of other bits that are flipped is odd, as mentioned, not counting the other counter bit, obviously. The middle bit is the really interesting one. It actually isn't used much. For that matter, it was the last one that I figured out. The default state for that bit is not to play the intro stage, so it will always be off if you finish a stage or die in one of the other stages. The only way to naturally get a password that has that bit flipped is to die in the intro stage, which also means that it's normally impossible to have both the middle and high bits flipped because you have to beat the intro stage to get the H in Freezeman stage. One thing that you might have seen is putting a 1 or an 8 in this square. That's because if you're past the intro stage and haven't gotten the H, the only possible numbers that can be here are 1 and 8. If you do have the H, the only possible numbers are 4 and 5. You can get a 2 or 3 here if you die in the intro stage. 3 requires getting at least 1 bolt from enemy drops since there are no other items you can get at that point. And the only way to see a 6 or 7 here is to cheat and give yourself the H plate while still being on the intro stage. Notably, while trying to set this bit at the same time as the one for clearing another stage will give you an error, understandably so, it seems like you can still give yourself whatever items you want, with the exception of the Proto Shield, which I'll talk about shortly. So if you want to start the intro stage with 999 bolts, an S-Tank, and the Super Adapter, you can. The 8th square controls the Proto Shield, bit 0 of the W tank count, and Burstman stage. The high bit will be flipped if you have the Proto Shield. It also seems to be the only exception to the items not being involved in error checking. You absolutely have to have the first half of stages beaten to be able to get the Proto Shield, or the password screen will show an error. The middle bit will be flipped if you have an odd number of W tanks, i.e. 1 or 3, since you can't get 5 or 7 without cheating. The low bit, of course, will be flipped if you've beaten Burstman. The 9th square handles Junkman, bit 2 of the bolt count, and bit 1 of the total item count. The high bit goes without saying, and again, I won't list all possible numbers for the middle bit. The low bit is the other one that you have to change based on how many other bits you've changed. The 10th square handles the U plate, beat being freed, and bit 1 of the E-tank count. The high bit is for the U. The middle bit actually has to be flipped before you can use any beat whistles, even if you set the bits for the number of those to a non-zero value. The lowest bit will be flipped if you have 2 or 3 E-tanks. The 11th square handles Freezeman, bit 0 of the beat whistle count, and the Robot Museum mid-stage. The high bit is obvious, the middle bit is flipped if you have an odd number of beat whistles, and the low bit is mostly obvious. It will clear the Robot Museum stage as expected. The interesting thing about it, though, is that you can actually set it without having the first 4 stage clear flags set, and that will make it possible to start out with all 8 stages selectable but not beaten. Obviously, you won't be able to do the Robot Museum. The game will give you invalid passwords until you do beat Freezeman, Cloudman, Junkman, and Burstman, though, and the second group of stages added bit must not be set for it to work. The 12th square handles bit 3 of the bolt count, whether or not you've given auto the hyperbolt, and whether or not you have rush search. All of these are pretty self-explanatory. High bit for the bolt, middle for the hyperbolt, low for rush search. The 13th square determines whether or not you have an S-Tank, bit 5 of the bolt count, and whether or not you have the rocket punch for the Super Adapter. In that order, from high to low, naturally. Having the rocket punch by itself doesn't do anything if you don't actually have the Super Adapter. The 14th square indicates whether or not you found the Hyperbolt, if Slashman stage is cleared, and bit 0 of the E-Tank count. The low bit, naturally, is set if you have an odd number of E-Tanks. The high bit specifically only marks that you have the Hyperbolt, not whether you've given it to auto, though if you do set the bit for having given it to auto already, that will take priority, and it doesn't seem to matter whether or not you flip this one. Obviously, the middle one does what it says, makes Slashman stage cleared, and good riddance to him, I say. The 15th square holds bit 6 of the bolt count, the flag for the Super Adapter, and the flag for the R plate. The high and low bits are pretty self-explanatory. Notably, though, you can flag the Super Adapter as being obtained without any of the rush circuit plates being collected and it will still work, but flagging all 4 of the circuit plates and not the Super Adapter seems to lock you out of ever getting the Super Adapter, so maybe don't do that. The 16th square, finally, holds bit 2 of the E-Tank count, the flag for the exit module, and the flag for beating Turboman stage. The high bit will be flipped if you have 4 E-Tanks, and the other 2 are obvious. So, recapping and rephrasing what I've said, Square 1 holds the bits for the S-plate, the rush jet, and the 1/28th place of the bolt count. It'll be an 8 if none of these things are true, a 1 to add 128 bolts, a 2 to have the rush jet, a 4 to have the S, a 3 to add the bolts and the rush jet, a 5 to add the bolts and the S, a 6 to have the rush jet and the S, and a 7 to have all 3. Square 2 holds the bits for Cloudman defeated, the energy balancer, and the second set of stages. It's a 7 for none of these, a 6 for the second set of stages only, a 5 for the energy balancer only, a 3 for Cloudman's weapon only, a 4 for the stages and the energy balancer, a 2 for the stages and Cloudman, a 1 for Cloudman beaten and the energy balancer, and an 8 for all 3. Square 3 holds the bits for the 2's place of the bolt count, the 256's place of the bolt count, and the 2's place of the beat whistle count. It's a 3 for none of these, a 2 if you have 2 or 3 beat whistles, a 1 to add 256 bolts, a 7 to add 2 bolts, an 8 if you have 2 or 3 beat whistles and anywhere from 256 through 511 or 768 through 999 bolts, a 6 if you have 2 or 3 whistles and add 2 bolts, a 5 if you have 2 or 3 whistles and add 256 bolts, and a 4 to have 2 or 3 beat whistles and add 258 bolts to your total count. Square 4 holds the bits for the 4's place of your W tanks, the 4's place of your beat whistles, and the 2's place of your W tanks. It's a 5 for none of these, a 4 if you have 2 or 3 W tanks, a 7 if you have 4 beat whistles, a 1 if you have 4 W tanks, a 6 if you have 2 or 3 W tanks and 4 beat whistles, It will never actually be an 8 in the legit password, but if it is, it will give you 6 W tanks. It will be a 3 if you have 4 beat whistles and 4 W tanks, and it will never be a 2 in a legit password either, but putting a 2 will give you 6 W tanks and 4 beat whistles. Square 5 holds the bits for opening up the Wily stages, the ones place of your bolts, and Springman defeated. It'll be a 2 if you haven't unlocked Wily's Fortress, have an even number of bolts, and haven't beaten Springman, while it will be a 3 if you've beaten Springman but neither of the other things are true, an 8 if you have an odd number of bolts, a 6 if you've unlocked Wily's Fortress, but it will never be a 6 since you can't do that without beating Springman, a 1 if you have Springman's weapon and an odd number of bolts, a 7 if you've beaten Springman and unlocked Wily's Fortress, a 4 if you have an odd number of bolts and have unlocked Wily's Fortress, which again is impossible without clearing Springman's stage, so this can never be a 4 either, and a 5 if you've beaten Springman, have an odd number of bolts, and have unlocked Wily's Fortress. Square 6 holds the bits for the 5/12's place of your bolts, the 16's place of your bolts, and Shademan defeated. It's a 5 for none of these, 4 for Shademan, 7 to add 16 bolts, 1 if you have 512 or more bolts, 6 to add Shademan's weapon and 16 bolts, 8 to add Shademan's weapon and 512 bolts, 3 to add 528 bolts, which is 512 plus 16, and 2 if you've beaten Shademan and your bolt count is 512 or greater but also contains a 16. Square 7 holds the bits for the H plate, playing the intro stage, and whether the total item count is even or odd. Well, I say item count, but of course it also includes all the bits for clearing the stages, and each individual bit in the binary representation of the number of bolts you have. If you have an even number of items, aren't starting at the intro stage, and don't have the H, this will be a 1. If you have an odd number of items, it's an 8. For an even number of items and starting at the intro stage, it's a 3. For an even number of items, no intro stage, and the H, it's a 5. For an odd number of items and starting at the intro stage, it's a 2. For an odd number of items and the H, it's a 4. To start at the intro stage with the H and an even number of items, it's a 7. And finally, to start at the intro stage with the H and an odd number of items, it's a 6. Of course, since you have to beat the intro stage before you can get the H, any passwords that have the H but also start you at the intro stage are impossible to get in normal gameplay, so you can never end up with the 6 or 7 here. Square 8 holds the bits for Burstman defeated, the 1's place of your W tanks, and the Proto Shield. It's a 7 for none of these, a 6 for Burstman, a 5 for 1 or 3 W tanks, a 3 for the Proto Shield, a 4 for Burstman and an odd number of W tanks, a 2 for Burstman and the Proto Shield, a 1 for an odd number of W tanks and the Proto Shield, and an 8 for Burstman, an odd number of W tanks, and the Proto Shield. Note that to have the Proto Shield, all of the first half of stages have to be cleared, which means that any password with a 3 or 1 here will give you an error no matter what the other numbers are. Square 9 holds the bits for the second item count bit, the 4's place of your bolts, and Junkman defeated. If the total number of items you have is a multiple of 4, or one more than a multiple of 4, the binary representation of the number of bolts doesn't include a 4, and Junkman's stage isn't cleared, this is a 4. If the total number of items is 1 less than a multiple of 4, or is an even number that isn't divisible by 4, this is a 5. To add 4 bolts, make it a 6. To have Junkman cleared, make it an 8. For the item count in the bolts, make it a 7. For the item count in Junkman, make it a 1. For the bolts in Junkman, make it a 2, and for all 3, make it a 3. Square 10 holds the bits for the 2's place of your E-tanks, freeing beat, and the U-plate. It's a 4 for none of those, a 5 to have 2 or 3 E-tanks, a 6 to free beat, an 8 to have the U, a 7 for 2 or 3 E-tanks and beat, a 1 for 2 or 3 E-tanks in the U, a 2 for beat in the U, and a 3 for 2 or 3 E-tanks, beat, and the U. Square 11 holds the bits for the Robot Museum mid-stage, the 1's place of the beat whistle count, and Freezeman cleared. For none of those, it's a 1, for the Robot Museum only, it's an 8, for 1 or 3 beat whistles, it's a 3, for Freezeman defeated, it's a 5, for the Robot Museum and an odd number of whistles, it's a 2, for the Robot Museum and Freezeman beaten, it's a 4, for an odd number of whistles and Freezeman, it's a 7, and for the Museum, an odd number of whistles and Freezeman's weapon, it's a 6. Note that you do still have to set the bit to free beat before you can actually use the whistles. If you put whistles in a password but don't set the flag to free beat, you won't get an error, but you won't get any whistles either. Square 12 holds the bits for having Rush Search, giving auto the Hyperbolt, and the 8's place of your bolts. It's a 6 for none of these, a 7 for Rush Search, a 4 for the Hyperbolt, a 2 to add 8 bolts, a 5 for the Rush Search and the Hyperbolt, a 3 for the Rush Search and 8 bolts, an 8 for the Hyperbolt and 8 regular bolts, and a 1 for all 3. Square 13 holds the bits for the Super Adapter Rocket Punch upgrade, the 32's place of your bolts, and the S-Tank. It's an 8 for none of these, 1 for the rocket punch, 2 to add 32 bolts, 4 to have an S-tank, 3 for the rocket punch and 32 bolts, 5 for the rocket punch and an S-tank, 6 for 32 bolts and an S-tank, and 7 for the rocket punch, 32 bolts, and an S-tank. The rocket punch, of course, won't do anything if you don't have the super adapter. Square 14 holds the bits for the ones place of your E-tanks, Slashman cleared, and finding the hyperbolt. It's a 3 for none of these, 2 for 1 or 3 E-tanks, 1 for Slashman, 7 to have the hyperbolt, 8 for an odd number of E-tanks and Slashman cleared, 6 for an odd number of E-tanks in the hyperbolt, 5 for Slashman in the hyperbolt, and 4 for all 3. The high bit here should not be confused with the other hyperbolt bit in square 12. This one says that you found it, but not necessarily that you actually gave it to Otto. If you set the other bit without setting this one, the other one seems to take precedence and Otto will have the bolt screwed in, but it will still appear in Springman's stage. Square 15 holds the bits for the R plate, the super adapter, and the 64's place of your bolts. It's a 6 for none of them, 7 for the R, 4 for the super adapter, 2 to add 64 bolts, 5 for the R and super adapter, 3 for the R and bolts, 8 for the super adapter and bolts, and 1 for all 3. Naturally, the game will never give you a 4 or 8 here, since you can't normally have the super adapter without also having the R, but if you're making your own passwords, you can flag just the super adapter and none of the letter plates and the game won't complain. Square 16 holds the bits for Turboman stage, the exit module, and the 4's place of your E-tanks. This is a 2 for none of those, a 3 for clearing Turboman, an 8 for the exit module, a 6 for 4 E-tanks, a 1 for Turboman and the exit, a 7 for Turboman and 4 E-tanks, a 4 for the exit and 4 E-tanks, and a 5 for Turboman, the exit module, and 4 E-tanks. So now you know everything you need about how to make any password you want, but there is also one special hard-coded password. It is 1415-5585-7823-6251, and it can do one of two things. If you put it in as you would any other password, it will take you straight to the final Wily stage with all the items, including a full stock of tanks and bolts. And that raises a question. If they had the capability to make the players start in Wily's Fortress from a password, why didn't the Wily stages have their own passwords? Sure, they used literally every possible bit and wouldn't have had room for them in the current system without sacrificing the 2 error-checking bits, but they could have sacrificed the intro stage bit, since anyone who wants to start from the intro stage probably isn't putting in a password anyway, and made you automatically have the super adapter if you have all 4 rush letters. That would have freed up the required 2 bits to hold the number of Wily stages you've beaten. They could have even made beat automatically count as freed if you have 0 to 4 beat whistles and initialized the starting number of them to 7 or something, which would have freed up another bit. It's kind of dumb that it took until Mega Man 11 for them not to require you to do all the Fortress stages in one sitting, or Mega Man 10 if you count easy mode. Anyway, the other function of this password comes when you hold down L and R while pressing start after putting it in. That will allow you to access a Street Fighter-esque 2-player minigame, which I suppose is kind of interesting. With that, that is the password system for Mega Man 7. It was kind of interesting figuring this stuff out. It makes me wonder if I could do something similar for the first 3 Mega Man X games, though from what I've heard, those can actually have multiple different patterns, which seems like it would get confusing. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this learning experience.